Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to dim the lights, toss aside the buzzing phone, and take a slow walk into the medieval night. A night that was not like ours at all. Because while we expect one long stretch of unconsciousness, medieval people thought of night as something different. Broken. Stitched into two halves, with a little waking world in between. And it wasn't considered strange. It was just life. You had your first sleep and then your second sleep. A pattern so normal that people wrote about it casually, as if everyone knew what it meant. Which they did. Until we forgot. So let's imagine it together. It's the 14th century. You're a farmer's son, or a weaver's daughter, or maybe some unfortunate soul whose whole job is scraping muck off a noble's boots. The day has been long. You've eaten a supper of coarse bread, probably with something unappealing like onions, beans, or, if you're very lucky, a scrap of salted pork. You sit by the fire until the last candle gutted out, and then, well, there's nothing else to do but lie down. Bedtime wasn't glamorous. Poor families often slept in one room. The whole household crowded onto straw pallets or a wooden board topped with hay and rags. The animals might be inside too, chickens in the corner, maybe a pig if you were trying to keep it from being stolen. And yes, that sounds unhygienic, but the medieval mindset was more concerned with warmth than with what the pig might track in. You fall asleep quickly, not because life is calm, but because exhaustion drags you under. And then, about 4 hours later, you wake up. Not tossing, not anxious, just awake. And that was fine. Because everybody else woke up too. This middle of the night interval was called the watch. Not insomnia, not a problem, just a normal gap. People might pray, or sit quietly, or poke at the fire so the house didn't freeze. Married couples often took this time for intimacy, because apparently nothing says romance like half asleep in the middle of winter while the cow is listening. Medieval doctors even recommended it as the healthiest, least sinful time to do so. Which, honestly, sounds like one of those medical tips that only a celibate monk would come up with. If you were literate, and extremely fortunate to own a book, you might read. More realistically, you might whisper stories to your children. Talk about the day. Or simply sit and think in the dark. Because that was the strange gift of the watch, an extra slice of time, carved out of the night, that belonged only to you. Of course, monks took this to extremes. Monastic schedules divided the night into bells, prayers, and chants. Matins, lauds, all very holy, all very interruptive. Picture a freezing stone chapel, candles flickering, robed figures mumbling psalms at 2 in the morning. While ordinary villagers used their watch to stretch and gossip, monks used theirs to convince God they were really dedicated. And possibly also to test how far the human body can go without REM sleep. Cities had their own midnight life. There were watchmen trudging through alleys, bells marking the hours, bakers already starting their ovens. The silent medieval night was never completely still. In some towns, people even visited neighbors during the watch. Imagine it, you wake up at 1 in the morning, decide you're bored, and wander next door to knock on the door with your candle stub in hand. And instead of calling the police, your neighbor is like, "Oh good, you're awake too. Want to complain about the miller again?" Dreams were taken seriously as well. A dream after first sleep might be considered more trustworthy than one after second sleep. Clergy and scholars wrote guides on interpreting them. Dreams could be divine messages, or warnings, or, if you had the misfortune of waking up paralyzed, proof that a demon sat on your chest. Sleep paralysis today is just your brain glitching. Back then, it was the mare, an evil spirit pinning you down. Which is somehow both scarier and more imaginative. Beds themselves told their own stories. The wealthy had elaborate frames, feather mattresses, heavy curtains to block drafts. Those canopy beds you see in museums weren't purely decorative, they were survival against falling dust, or worse, rodents scurrying through the rafters. Because nothing ruins second sleep like a medieval mouse making a surprise skydive onto your pillow. Castles, meanwhile, were freezing. Huge stone rooms, drafty halls, smoke drifting from half-dead fires. A royal bed might look magnificent, embroidered with silks, but the air inside was cold enough to make your teeth chatter. So kings and queens piled on layers of furs, and slept surrounded by attendants, servants, or guards. Privacy was rare, even in luxury. So what changed? Why don't we wake up naturally in the middle of the night anymore? The short answer: light. For thousands of years, the rhythm of sleep was tied to the sun and the cost of burning candles. But starting in the 17th century, with better lamps, cheaper candles, and eventually gaslighting, people stayed up later. Bedtime shifted closer to midnight. There wasn't enough time for a first sleep and a second sleep anymore. And by the 19th century, doctors had declared segmented sleep unhealthy. Which was ironic, because humanity had been doing it forever without complaint. But Victorian medicine loved labeling everything as a disorder, including, apparently, the way our ancestors had always slept. And so, first and second sleep quietly disappeared. Now, if you wake up at 2 a.m., you're told you have a problem. Back then, you would have shrugged, stoked the fire, maybe had a snack, and waited for second sleep to come. It's tempting to think we lost something in that transition. The idea of a natural pause in the night, a time when you could sit, reflect, or just exist without pressure, feels almost luxurious today. We cram all our rest into one block, and if we wake up, we panic about being broken. But medieval people had a rhythm that accepted wakefulness as part of the night. So maybe, the next time you find yourself awake in the dark hours, you can take a little comfort. You're not failing at modern sleep. You're simply echoing the rhythm of the past. Living like a villager in a thatched hut, or a monk in a cold cloister, or a noble under heavy furs. First sleep. Watch. Second sleep. A forgotten pattern, but one that once shaped every night. And with that, let's drift gently out of the medieval night and float toward another corner of history. Because the world doesn't stop at bedtime. And there are plenty of odd, dusty stories still waiting for us. So, we've wandered through the medieval night. Let's drift a little further back, into an age where royalty didn't just collect jewels or concubines. Some of them actually collected books. Or at least, clay tablets that counted as books when paper wasn't really a thing. We're heading to Mesopotamia, land of ziggurats, baked mud, and kings who loved carving their victories into stone walls so no one would ever forget how impressive they were. And among all those kings, one stands out for his slightly unusual hobby: Ashurbanipal of Assyria. A man who basically said, conquering nations is fun, but you know what's even better? Building the world's first great library. Yes, you heard that right. The guy was basically the original overachieving bookworm, except, instead of comfy shelves and librarians in cardigans, his collection was a mountain of clay tablets that weighed more than your average medieval serf. Now, Ashurbanipal wasn't supposed to be king, which is always a good setup for drama. He was a younger son, more interested in reading and writing than stabbing people. And in royal families, that usually made you about as respected as a pigeon at a coronation. But when fate shuffled the dynastic deck, he ended up ruling anyway. And once he did, he put his nerd streak to work. The man could actually read and write in multiple languages, which for a Mesopotamian king was about as rare as finding a noble who bathed twice in the same week. Most rulers just hired scribes and shouted orders at them. Ashurbanipal? He wanted to do the scribbling himself. He collected myths, rituals, medical texts, letters, royal decrees, basically anything he could get his hands on. And because he was a king, getting his hands on usually meant sending armies to loot temples and libraries in other cities. Picture your local warlord storming into town and saying, "I'll take the gold, the women, and those dusty tablets over there, thanks." His collection grew into the Library of Nineveh. Tens of thousands of tablets, carefully stacked in palace rooms, covering everything from astrology to how to cure a cow's indigestion. Which, honestly, is exactly the kind of knowledge you want preserved for future generations. Forget epic poetry, tell me how to fix my bloated livestock. And of course, he also kept copies of the classics. One of the most famous finds from his library was the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's right, the world's oldest recorded story about a king, a wild man, a giant flood, and a whole lot of existential angst. Thanks to Ashurbanipal's hoarding habits, that tale survived. Without him, Gilgamesh might have just been ancient gossip, lost in the sands of time. The library wasn't organized in the way we imagine libraries today. No cozy reading chairs, no shushing librarians glaring at you. Instead, shelves and rooms of heavy tablets, some with little labels in cuneiform telling you what they were about. It was functional, but let's be honest, not user-friendly. If you wanted to find omens for good harvest, you had to squint at wedge-shaped scribbles on slabs of clay, while probably praying you didn't drop one on your foot. And yet, this was revolutionary. Because Ashurbanipal understood something that most war-hungry kings didn't. Knowledge was power. Not just the kind that told you when to attack your neighbors, but the kind that let you peek into the workings of the universe. What did the gods want? What did the stars mean? What medicine worked, or at least didn't kill the patient immediately? All of that mattered. And hoarding knowledge was a way of hoarding control. Of course, all good things come to an end, especially when your empire is basically one long victory lap waiting for a collapse. After Ashurbanipal's death, the Assyrian Empire crumbled spectacularly. Nineveh was attacked, looted, and burned in the late 7th century BCE, which, in a weird twist of fate, is the only reason his library survived. See, when clay tablets are caught in a massive fire, they don't disintegrate. They bake. They harden. Like pottery. So while the palace walls collapsed, while the treasures were looted, while people were probably running for their lives, the library was being accidentally preserved. Instead of dust, it became an archaeological jackpot. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and in the 19th century, a group of British archaeologists decided to dig around the ruins of Nineveh. These guys were the kind of gentlemen explorers who thought smashing through ancient walls was a fun holiday activity. And to their surprise, they unearthed thousands upon thousands of tablets. At first, they didn't even realize what they'd found. Imagine opening a box and seeing 20,000 bricks covered in weird lines. Not exactly a light red. But eventually, scholars pieced it together. This was Ashurbanipal's library, the world's first organized collection of written knowledge. And suddenly, we had a window into ancient Mesopotamian thought. Flood myths, rituals, omens, medical recipes that involved things like apply beer and crushed turtle shell. You know, cutting-edge science. It's funny, though, because the library's rediscovery was kind of chaotic. Early translators made a mess of it. Victorian scholars loved dramatizing everything. They rushed to link Gilgamesh to the biblical flood, waving the tablets around like they'd solved all of theology. Meanwhile, other sections of the library were less glamorous. Dozens of tablets listing debts, or sacrificial checklists, or complaints about deliveries gone missing. Basically the ancient equivalent of finding the DMV archives. Still, it's impossible not to be impressed. Ashurbanipal's dusty obsession ended up being one of the greatest gifts to history. And it tells us something very human, that even in an age of conquests, palaces, and endless wars, there was one ruler who thought knowledge was worth preserving, even if he had to loot it from someone else first. The library, in its own way, was a reflection of Ashurbanipal himself, a mix of the scholarly and the ruthless. Because while he loved reading, let's not kid ourselves, he was still an Assyrian king, which meant cruelty came with the crown. Records describe him parading defeated rulers in chains, gouging eyes, piling corpses. So yes, he was a bibliophile, but one with blood-stained hands. A man who saw no contradiction in treasuring a love poem one moment and executing prisoners the next. Multitasking, ancient style. And yet, history doesn't always remember the cruelty as much as the clay. What sticks is that, because of him, we can still read the laments of priests, the dreams of poets, the tedious accounting of grain stores. Whole voices from 3,000 years ago, whispering across time, baked hard in the ruins of Nineveh. So next time you look at your bookshelf and wonder if you're hoarding too many novels, just remember Ashurbanipal. Your book collection has nothing on him. And at least your library won't crush anyone if it topples. Probably. And with that, let's gently close the heavy stone doors of Nineveh and drift onward. Because across the ancient world, there was another wonder, rising out of the sea, guiding ships with fire and mirrors. The lighthouse of Alexandria, waiting for us just ahead. So, we've left behind the dusty shelves of Nineveh, with their clay tablets and ominous flood stories, and now we're going to stand on the edge of the Mediterranean, staring at a giant stone tower that once told sailors, "Hey, land is this way, try not to crash your boat." The lighthouse of Alexandria. one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Which, of course, is the ancient world's way of saying, this was impressive, and everyone who visited couldn't stop bragging about it. It rose on the island of Pharos, just off the coast of Alexandria in Egypt. And the city itself had been founded by Alexander the Great. Because when you're Alexander, you don't just conquer the known world, you also name cities after yourself like some kind of ancient real estate mogul. And Alexandria became his most famous namesake. Bustling trade, libraries, scholars, and, to top it off, a massive lighthouse to wow the tourists. Construction started around the 3rd century BCE, under Ptolemy II, one of Alexander's successors. And when I say successor, what I really mean is, one of the Macedonian generals who carved up Alexander's empire like a pie at a family dinner. Ptolemy got Egypt, which, all things considered, was a pretty sweet slice. And he wanted Alexandria to shine. Literally. So, he ordered the lighthouse. Now, the thing about this lighthouse is that it wasn't just tall. It was ridiculously tall. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 300 to 400 feet. To put that in perspective, that's basically a 40-story building. Out of stone. Built by people without cranes, without steel beams, and without modern safety codes. Which, given ancient construction methods, probably meant a lot of oops, there goes another worker into the harbor. But the result was stunning. A square base, a cylindrical middle, and a smaller top tier, like a stone wedding cake for giants. On top, a huge flame burned. Mirrors, supposedly polished bronze ones, reflected the fire by day and magnified it by night, sending a beam of light across the sea. Sailors could see it from miles away. Which is great, because the coast of Egypt is basically one big try not to wreck your ship here zone, with sandbanks lurking everywhere. It's easy to forget how revolutionary this was. Before lighthouses, sailors had to rely on stars, luck, and the occasional desperate prayer. A giant tower of light was the ancient equivalent of Google Maps yelling, "Turn left now." It made Alexandria not just impressive, but safe, which, of course, meant more trade, more money, more prestige. The Ptolemies loved that. And yes, there were legends, because no ancient wonder is complete without a little exaggeration. Some writers claimed the lighthouse had magical mirrors that could set enemy ships on fire from miles away. Which, let's be honest, sounds like a bad plot from a cartoon villain. Bronze mirrors are shiny, but they're not laser cannons. Still, it made a great story, and scared enough people that no one wanted to test the theory. The lighthouse also became so iconic that Pharos, the name of the island, became the root word for lighthouse in many languages. Even today, if you speak French, Spanish, or Italian, their words for lighthouse trace back to Pharos. That's some serious branding power. Inside, we can imagine spiral ramps leading up, wide enough for donkeys to haul fuel to the top. Because someone had to keep that fire going every single night. Imagine being the poor worker stuck with eternal flame duty. Your whole job, carry wood or oil up endless ramps, make sure the fire doesn't go out, and don't slip, or else you'll be remembered as the guy who set Alexandria on fire. The lighthouse stood for centuries. Earthquakes shook it, storms battered it, but it remained a proud symbol on the coastline. Medieval Arab travelers still described it, though usually with numbers that sound a little too enthusiastic, like when someone swears their fishing trip catch was this big. Eventually, after repeated earthquakes in the 10th to 14th centuries, the lighthouse gave up. Stones tumbled into the sea. By the time Europeans came looking, it was gone, just a memory in old texts. But the ruins didn't stay lost. Divers in the 20th century found massive blocks underwater near Alexandria's harbor. Some even carved with ancient inscriptions. Today, bits of the lighthouse rest quietly beneath the waves, a jumbled reminder that even wonders can crumble. What's fascinating is how the lighthouse reflected not just light, but the ambition of its builders. The Ptolemies wanted to prove they were more than foreign rulers squatting in Egypt. They wanted monuments. The library, the lighthouse, both symbols that said, we are cultured, powerful, eternal. And yet, both eventually fell. The library burned, the lighthouse collapsed, and the Ptolemies themselves fizzled out after generations of inbreeding and drama. Looking at you, Cleopatra. Still, the image of the lighthouse endures. You can almost picture it, a colossal tower rising from the sea, smoke curling from its flame, mirrors catching the sunlight, sailors cheering as they realize they're not going to die on the rocks tonight. A beacon of safety, and of pride. And it's oddly comforting. Because even though it's gone, the idea that people 2,300 years ago were already building skyscrapers to help each other find their way home, it makes the world feel a little smaller. Like we've always been trying to light the dark, one flame at a time. And with that, let's quietly leave the waves lapping against the ruins of Pharos. Our next stop takes us back inland, into palaces where the nights were colder, stranger, and where power didn't just belong to kings, but to the people who stood behind them. Whispering in the shadows, shaping empires, all while being cut off from family forever. The eunuchs of China's Han Dynasty, waiting in the flicker of torchlight. So, we've had peasants waking up in the middle of the night, kings hoarding clay tablets, and sailors not crashing into rocks. Now let's wander into the palaces of ancient China, where some of the most powerful people weren't kings, weren't nobles, and weren't generals, but eunuchs. Yes. Men who, shall we say, had undergone some rather drastic surgery. The kind of surgery you don't come back from. They were cut off, quite literally, from ordinary life. And yet, somehow, they ended up pulling the strings of the empire itself. Let's set the stage. The Han Dynasty. China, over 2,000 years ago. A dynasty that loved bureaucracy almost as much as it loved long robes and elaborate titles. At the top, of course, was the emperor, son of heaven, lord of all under the skies. But emperors were often very young, very sheltered, and very distracted by palace life, which left plenty of room for other figures to step in. Enter the eunuchs. These were men, often servants, who had been castrated, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. The idea was simple: remove the possibility of family ambition. A eunuch couldn't father children, which, in theory, meant he wouldn't build his own dynasty or threaten the throne. To the emperors, they seemed safe, loyal, harmless. Of course, this backfired spectacularly, because when you remove traditional family ambitions, what you often get is someone who throws all their energy into gaining power right where they are. And the palace became their family, the emperor their son, or their puppet. It didn't hurt that eunuchs had unique access. Unlike ministers and generals, who had to bow and scrape for an audience, eunuchs lived inside the palace. They guarded the doors. They served the food. They tucked the emperor into bed, which meant they were always nearby, whispering, suggesting, guiding. It's hard to say no to someone who literally knows when you've had indigestion from last night's feast. At first, their roles were modest. Servants, cleaners, the people who made sure the palace ran smoothly. But as centuries rolled on, they crept upward. By the Eastern Han period, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were confidants, advisors, and eventually, kingmakers. Some emperors practically raised eunuchs as foster brothers. Others treated them as the only people they could trust, since aristocrats and ministers were always plotting. And you can kind of see the logic. A eunuch couldn't start a dynasty, but he could absolutely ruin yours if you crossed him. And so, the palace filled with intrigue. Ministers hated the eunuchs. Eunuchs hated the ministers. Each side accused the other of corruption, which, to be fair, was accurate on both counts. Everyone was corrupt. It was just a matter of who was better at pretending otherwise. There are stories of emperors granting eunuchs vast estates, titles, even command of armies. Entire cliques of eunuchs controlled the court, deciding who got promoted, who got punished, and who conveniently disappeared. Ministers would complain, but often the emperor trusted the eunuchs more, because the ministers had families, clans, and power bases outside the palace. Eunuchs had none of that. Or at least, none officially. By the late Han, the tension boiled over. Ministers launched purges against eunuchs. Eunuchs launched purges against ministers. Heads rolled, metaphorically and literally. One emperor famously executed thousands of people for criticizing his beloved eunuch clique. Which, honestly, feels a little excessive. But then again, emperors weren't exactly known for subtlety. The eunuchs weren't saints, either. Many became staggeringly corrupt. They sold offices. They took bribes. They manipulated succession to favor child emperors they could control. One group, the so-called 10 attendants, became so notorious that their names are practically shorthand for palace rot. Imagine being remembered in history not as wise counselors but as the 10 guys who ruined everything. And yet, it wasn't all scheming. Some eunuchs genuinely cared for the emperors they served. Some acted as guardians when a child emperor was surrounded by predatory relatives. A few even left behind reputations for loyalty and integrity. It's easy to paint them all as villains, but in truth, they were products of a system that put them in impossible roles. The irony is that eunuchs often outlasted the emperors they served. A minister might rise and fall with his clan, a general might die in battle, but eunuchs, living inside the palace walls, keeping their heads down until the right moment, could wield influence across decades. The empire might wobble outside, but in the hushed corridors of the Forbidden Palace, it was the eunuchs who kept the gears turning. Their power wasn't unique to the Han, either. The pattern repeated throughout Chinese history. Tang, Ming, you name it. In fact, during the Ming dynasty, one eunuch, Zheng He, commanded enormous treasure fleets that sailed all the way to Africa. So much for being safe and harmless. But in the Han dynasty, it was the beginning. The moment when emperors realized that their most dangerous allies might also be their closest. The eunuchs became the shadows behind the throne. Sometimes loyal, sometimes treacherous, always watching. When the dynasty finally collapsed, people blamed them. It's convenient, after all, to pin centuries of dysfunction on a handful of palace servants. Ministers wrote bitter accounts of eunuch corruption. Later historians took those accounts and ran with them, turning eunuchs into villains of the grand story. And while they certainly weren't innocent, it's a little too neat. Because the truth is, the emperors needed them, trusted them, created the system that empowered them. So perhaps the eunuchs were less the cause, and more the symptom of dynasties that put too much power in too few hands. It's a strangely haunting legacy. Men who gave up their families, their futures, their very bodies, and in return, gained whispers of power that could make or break an empire. They were trusted because they could never pass on their influence. And yet, in practice, their influence echoed for centuries. And so, in the flickering lamplight of the Han palaces, you can imagine them moving silently through corridors, carrying scrolls, pouring wine, leaning close to the emperor with a suggestion, a warning, a name. Always there, always in the background. The empire might belong to the Son of Heaven, but the voice in his ear, that was often a eunuch. And with that, we slowly closed the palace doors, leaving the echoes of whispered politics behind. 4 stories, 4 slices of history. From peasants waking at midnight, to kings who loved books, to towers of fire by the sea, to palace servants who ruled from the shadows. Strange, sleepy reminders that history is never simple, and never quite as far away as it seems. So, wherever you are, drifting, dozing, or still awake, let these voices from the past keep you company. And may your second sleep, unlike the medieval one, arrive without interruption. Now, we're not starting with kings charging into battle, or medieval peasants arguing with their cows. Tonight, we're going to curl up with one of the oldest bookworms in history. A man who, instead of just carving his name into monuments and pretending that was enough, decided he needed an entire library to prove how cultured he was. We're talking about Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century BCE. Ruler of an empire so aggressive that its main diplomatic strategy was submit to us, or we'll flay you alive. And yet, despite living in a world where cruelty was basically a job description, Ashurbanipal wanted to be remembered for something else too. Not just for the piles of skulls, but for the piles of clay tablets. That's right. Tonight, we're going to the Library of Nineveh. The closest thing the ancient world had to a national library, except instead of paperbacks and comfy chairs, it was filled with heavy slabs of baked mud that could break your foot if you tried to reshelve one too quickly. Ashurbanipal wasn't supposed to be king. That honor usually went to the oldest son, the one raised on a steady diet of hunting, boasting, and stabbing. Ashurbanipal was the second son, the one who liked reading. He was taught to write in cuneiform, which was already an impressive flex, because most kings didn't bother. Writing was for scribes. Kings just dictated their shopping lists and had someone else do the tedious wedge marks. But Ashurbanipal? He wanted to do it himself. Imagine the kid in school who not only turns in his own essay but volunteers to grade everyone else's, too. When fate shuffled the royal family and his older brother conveniently got bumped out of the line of succession, Ashurbanipal ended up on the throne. And once he got there, he didn't just want to rule. He wanted to collect. Not coins, not weapons, not wives, though he probably had those too, but knowledge. And because he was king, collecting knowledge didn't mean wandering down to the bookstore. It meant sending soldiers to loot temples in Babylon, scribal houses in Sumer, and anywhere else that had anything vaguely tablet-shaped. His orders were pretty clear: bring me everything. Religious texts, medical recipes, omens, farming guides, poetry, even boring tax records. I want it all. Which is one way to fill your shelves. Eventually, his palace at Nineveh had room after room stacked with thousands of these tablets. Some estimate over 30,000. Which sounds impressive until you realize most of them were basically copies. Clay wasn't cheap to produce, and Ashurbanipal really didn't like the idea of losing anything, so he ordered multiple versions of everything. Half the library was essentially backup hard drives. Still, the content was fascinating. The Epic of Gilgamesh was there, the world's oldest surviving epic. Myths about gods squabbling, heroes sulking, and a great flood that suspiciously resembles another great flood you might have heard about in a later book. Without Ashurbanipal's hoarding, Gilgamesh might have been lost forever. There were also medical texts. Recipes that sound more like witchcraft than medicine. Things like apply beer to the wound or burn turtle shell, mix with herbs, and smear on patient. Surprisingly, some of it actually worked, at least the beer part, because alcohol is antiseptic. Other times, not so much. You don't really want to know what they recommended for dental problems. Then there were omens. Endless omens. The ancient Assyrians loved the idea that everything was a sign from the gods. Sheep entrails? Read them like a book. A bird flying the wrong way? Doom. Lightning striking at the wrong time? Definitely doom. Honestly, most of their omens ended in doom. The tablets in the library included entire manuals on how to interpret these little cosmic hints. If you thought astrology columns were bad today, imagine a 40-tablet series titled, What It Means When the Liver Has a Weird Spot. And yet, through all the oddities, there's something beautiful. This was a king who wanted it all written down. Who didn't just want to conquer, but to catalogue. And not just for himself. Ashurbanipal seemed to understand that storing knowledge was a kind of immortality. Kings die, empires fall, but tablets last. Of course, not everything about Ashurbanipal was scholarly. He could be as vicious as any Assyrian ruler when it suited him. Records brag about him humiliating captured kings, torturing rebels, piling corpses by city gates. You know, the usual Assyrian weekend activity. The fact that he also liked to read doesn't erase the fact that he was basically running a brutal dictatorship. He was the original multitasker, poetry in the morning, executions after lunch. But it worked. For a while. Until the empire collapsed, as empires do. After Ashurbanipal's death, Assyria imploded. Nineveh was besieged and burned in 612 BCE. And here's the strange twist. That destruction is the only reason his library survived. The fire that consumed the palace baked the tablets harder. Like clay pottery in a kiln. Instead of turning to dust, they were preserved. Fast forward 2,000 years. 19th century archaeologists digging in the ruins of Nineveh stumbled upon piles and piles of these tablets. At first, they didn't even realize what they had. Just stacks of bricks with squiggles. It took decades before scholars pieced together the language, painstakingly translating wedge-shaped cuneiform into modern words. And slowly, the voice of Ashurbanipal's library returned. Imagine that. A man obsessed with hoarding knowledge, convinced it might outlast him, and it did. Not in the way he expected. Not neatly stored in his palace, but broken and scattered, found by strangers centuries later. Still, his plan sort of worked. We remember him today not for his wars, but for his library. And maybe that's what makes this story so quietly satisfying. Because in the end, Ashurbanipal, the bookish king, proved himself right. Knowledge endures, even when everything else burns down around it. And with that, let's close the dusty shelves of Nineveh and drift on. There's another ancient marvel waiting for us. A tower rising out of the sea, blazing with fire, guiding lost sailors home. The lighthouse of Alexandria. So, we've tiptoed out of Nineveh's dusty library, where kings collected clay like some people collect stamps, and now we're going to step into the salty breeze of the Mediterranean. Imagine waves slapping against stone walls, the smell of fish and tar, and somewhere in the distance, a colossal tower of light telling sailors, "Relax, land is over here." The lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which is basically the ancient version of making the top 7 must-see attractions list, except nobody bothered to update it after 200 BCE. Still, the lighthouse earned its spot, not because it was flashy or covered in gold, but because it was useful. And yet, it still managed to look ridiculously impressive. It all began with Alexander the Great. Of course it did. He couldn't pass a coastline without founding a city and slapping his name on it. Alexandria became his most famous namesake, sitting on Egypt's north coast like a glittering trading hub. After Alexander dropped dead, as overachievers often do, his general Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and decided Alexandria needed a few upgrades. You know, something to show off. Something to say, yes, I may technically be a foreigner ruling Egypt, but look at this giant tower, isn't it great? And so, around the 3rd century BCE, construction began on the lighthouse. Or as they called it, the Pharos, named after the little island it was built on. From then on, Pharos became the root word for lighthouse in a bunch of languages. Talk about brand recognition. The tower itself was a beast. Ancient writers claimed it stood 300 to 400 feet tall. That's taller than most modern apartment buildings. And remember, this was before cranes, before steel girders, before OSHA compliance. Workers were stacking massive limestone blocks by hand, probably muttering under their breath the whole time. The design was clever, though. A square base, then a cylindrical middle, then a smaller tier on top, like a 3-layer cake, but one you definitely don't want to eat. At the very top sat the fire, a massive flame that burned all night, fueled by wood or oil. During the day, polished bronze mirrors supposedly reflected sunlight across the sea. Sailors could see the light from miles away. Considering how easy it was to wreck a ship on Egypt's shifting sandbanks, that flame was the difference between safe harbor and sorry, your cargo of olives is now fish food. Naturally, legends grew. Some claimed the mirrors could be used as weapons, focusing sunlight to set enemy ships ablaze. Which sounds impressive, and suspiciously like something a bored storyteller would make up after too much wine. Bronze mirrors are shiny, sure, but they're not ancient death lasers. Still, the story stuck, because people love the idea of a wonder of the world doubling as a superweapon. Inside the tower, spiral ramps wound upward, wide enough for donkeys to trudge along with loads of fuel. Imagine the unlucky worker whose entire career was climb, dump wood, repeat. Keep the eternal flame going, or risk the wrath of every sailor in the Mediterranean. And don't even think about dozing off, because if the fire went out, you'd probably get thrown into the harbor as motivation for your replacement. The lighthouse wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. For the Ptolemies, it announced Alexandria as a center of power and wealth. The city already had the great library, filled with scrolls stolen from visiting ships. Now it had a tower so tall that travelers couldn't miss it. It was part beacon, part brag. A way of saying, yes, we have the best harbor. And yes, we want you to be very impressed while you dock. For centuries, the lighthouse stood proud. Travelers described it in glowing terms, often exaggerating its size. That's how you know something is impressive, when every tourist suddenly adds 50 extra feet in their descriptions. Arab scholars in the medieval period still wrote about it, though usually with numbers that sound suspiciously like "my fish was this big." But nothing lasts forever. Earthquakes rattled the Egyptian coast in the 10th, 11th, and 14th centuries, each one knocking more stones loose. Bit by bit, the great Pharos crumbled. By the time Europeans came poking around in the Renaissance, it was gone, reduced to ruins under the sea. And because human beings are endlessly practical, those fallen stones were later used to build fortresses. Nothing says legacy like your wonder of the world being recycled into someone else's castle wall. Still, the lighthouse isn't completely lost. In the 20th century, divers discovered massive stone blocks underwater near the harbor of Alexandria. Carvings, fragments, pieces of that ancient giant still resting where they fell centuries before. Today, some of them have even been raised, displayed in museums. Not quite a wonder anymore, but still whispering its story from beneath the waves. What makes the lighthouse of Alexandria so oddly soothing to think about is how human it was. It wasn't built to glorify a god, or to entomb a king, or to dazzle with luxury. It was built to help people not die at sea. That's it. A practical gift, wrapped in monumental architecture. And yet, it became a symbol of something bigger. Hope. Safety. A light in the dark. Sailors looking out from rough seas, praying for land, and finally spotting that flame. It must have felt like salvation. And maybe that's why it stayed in memory as one of the great wonders. Because we've always wanted a light guiding us home. And even now, if you stand on the coast of Alexandria, you can still imagine it. A colossal tower rising above the water. Flames curling into the night. Mirrors flashing in the day. Sailors cheering in relief. A beacon that stood for centuries, and still shines in imagination. And with that, let's leave the rolling waves behind and drift back into the shadows of palaces. Because in another empire, far from the Mediterranean, the most powerful men weren't kings or generals at all. They were the servants standing just behind the throne. The eunuchs of the Han dynasty, whispering in the dark, shaping history, one quiet suggestion at a time. So, we've wandered through the midnight habits of medieval peasants, browsed Ashurbanipal's hoard of baked mud books, and stared up at a giant Mediterranean flashlight. Now we're gliding east, into the polished courtyards of ancient China. A world of silk robes, lacquered screens, and emperors who ruled by divine mandate, at least on paper. In reality, the palace was crawling with figures who had far less obvious power, but who managed to run the show anyway. I'm talking about the eunuchs. Men who had been permanently altered so they could never start families of their own. Which, in theory, made them safe servants. You can't overthrow the emperor if you can't pass on your name. At least, that was the logic. In practice, eunuchs ended up being some of the most powerful, feared, and resented people in Chinese history. Let's settle into the Han dynasty. This is over 2,000 years ago. Rome was just cutting its teeth in the West, while in China, the Han were building an empire that would last 4 centuries. The emperors were called sons of heaven, and everyone was supposed to bow to their word. But emperors had a problem. They lived in palaces surrounded by walls, gates, guards, and endless protocol. That made them distant from their ministers and generals. The people who could actually reach them every day. Eunuchs. It started simply. Eunuchs looked after the emperor's chambers. They guarded the harem, since, awkward truth, they were considered safe around imperial wives and concubines. They handled the details of court life, clothes, meals, schedules. But here's the thing. Once you're the one deciding who gets in to see the emperor, you suddenly control everything. If a minister can't deliver his urgent petition because you forgot to pass it on, his career just ended. If a rival gets ushered in at the right moment, suddenly he's the emperor's new favorite. Over time, some eunuchs became confidants. The emperor trusted them because they had no families, no clans, no dynastic ambitions. Or at least, none that seemed obvious. A eunuch couldn't set up his own ruling house. But that didn't stop him from controlling the one already in power. The real escalation came when emperors were young. If you're a child on the throne, who do you turn to? Ministers? They're scary, old, and always arguing. Relatives? They're usually plotting how to get rid of you. The eunuchs, though, they're in your rooms every day. They tuck you in, bring you snacks, tell you bedtime stories. They feel like family. And once a child emperor grew up with them, their influence was locked in. By the Eastern Han period, eunuchs weren't just caretakers. They were power brokers. They sold government posts. They took bribes. They arranged assassinations. They manipulated which princes got to become heir, carefully picking emperors who would stay dependent on them. Not exactly the harmless servants the job description implied. The ministers of court absolutely hated this. They saw themselves as guardians of tradition, educated Confucian gentlemen who should be running the state. Having to beg favors from eunuchs, who came from poor or low-born backgrounds, was humiliating. And so, the palace became a battlefield, not of swords, but of whispers and petitions. Ministers accusing eunuchs of corruption. Eunuchs accusing ministers of treason. Every emperor had to choose which side to favor, and spoiler, they usually chose the eunuchs. Why? Because ministers had clans. Big extended families, full of sons and cousins who all wanted cushy jobs. Eunuchs had nothing. Their only loyalty was to the emperor. At least, that's how emperors like to think about it. Reality was a little messier. Eunuchs still wanted power, wealth, and security. They just funneled it all into themselves instead of passing it to children. By the 2nd century CE, the eunuchs had basically taken over. One clique, known as the 10 attendants, became infamous for running the court into the ground. And yes, there were more than 10 of them. Ancient historians loved round numbers. The 10 attendants were blamed for manipulating emperors, silencing critics, and draining the treasury. Whether they were truly that bad or just convenient scapegoats is still debated, but the hatred stuck. Ministers staged purges. Eunuchs staged counter-purges. Thousands died in the back and forth. If you were a scholar official, one wrong word about the eunuchs could get you imprisoned or worse. But it wasn't all villainy. Some eunuchs were genuinely loyal. They protected emperors from scheming relatives. They acted as guardians when chaos threatened the court. The problem is that history is usually written by scholars, the very people who hated eunuchs most. So the stories we inherit tend to emphasize the corruption, not the loyalty. It's possible the truth was both. Some were greedy manipulators. Others were simply doing their jobs in an impossible system. What makes the eunuch story so quietly fascinating is the irony. They were supposed to be powerless. Their condition was designed to exclude them from dynastic politics. And yet, precisely because of that, they ended up closer to power than anyone else. They became indispensable. And once you're indispensable, well, you get bold. It all came crashing down eventually. By the late Han, the constant infighting between eunuchs and ministers helped weaken the dynasty. Rebel armies rose. Warlords carved up the empire. And the eunuchs, once so powerful, were slaughtered in the chaos. It was a brutal end to a strange experiment in palace politics. But the pattern didn't stop there. Later dynasties repeated it. Over and over, eunuchs gained power, became corrupt, and were eventually purged. The cycle lasted all the way to the Ming, when one eunuch, Zheng He, commanded treasure fleets that sailed across the Indian Ocean. From humble servants to global explorers, not bad for a group that supposedly had no future. If you walk through the ruins of Han palaces today, it's hard to picture it. Silent courtyards, crumbling bricks, weeds where ministers once argued. But in those spaces, eunuchs moved quietly, carrying scrolls, delivering food, whispering in ears. They weren't kings. They weren't generals. But their shadows shaped empires. And maybe that's the thought to take with you tonight. That sometimes, the people who seem powerless, the ones history says are safe or harmless, end up leaving the deepest marks. Not through armies, but through whispers in the dark. And with that, let's let the palace lamps burn low. Because we're going to drift back west for our last story. To a world where nights were long, sleep was broken, and people woke up halfway through to tell stories by candlelight. The strange, forgotten rhythm of medieval sleep. So far, we've wandered through the dusty shelves of Nineveh, watched a great flame tower over the Mediterranean, and listened to eunuchs whisper in the shadows of palaces. Now, for our last drift through history tonight, let's do something a little different. Not kings or monuments or wars. Just sleep. Because in medieval Europe, the night wasn't a single stretch of unconsciousness. It was broken, divided, woven into two halves, with a strange waking interval in the middle. It wasn't a disorder. Nobody thought it was weird. It was just life. First sleep, then the watch, then second sleep. Like a two-part bedtime series. Picture it. You're a peasant in 14th century France. You've spent the day breaking your back in muddy fields, eating bread that tastes like despair, and dodging whatever new tax your lord has dreamed up. After choking down a little stew and maybe some ale, you and your family collapse onto straw mattresses. The bed smells faintly of hay, smoke, and the pig you decided to keep inside for warmth. It's cozy, in a rustic, flea-infested way. You drift off quickly. 4 hours later, you wake up. Not panicked, not restless, just awake. And so is everyone else. Some poke at the fire. Some whisper. Some shuffle outside to relieve themselves under the stars. And some take advantage of the recommended conjugal window. Medieval doctors swore the hours between first and second sleep were the healthiest time for intimacy. Apparently, being half asleep was good for your constitution. But it wasn't only couples making use of the night watch. People prayed. Monks always prayed. It was basically their brand. They had whole services timed for midnight, because why not drag yourself from bed in the freezing dark to chant psalms? Other people told stories, or recited dreams, or just sat quietly in the dark. Imagine a whole extra pocket of time each night to think, reflect, or gossip about your neighbors. The miller's wife said what? At 1 in the morning? Pass the candle, I need details. And dreams mattered. Dreams weren't random nonsense. They were messages. Visions from God, or angels, or maybe demons if you'd had too much cheese before bed. Entire manuals explained how to interpret them. Dream of falling? A warning. Dream of eating? Good harvest. Dream of fish? Well, someone would find a meaning, even if they had to invent it. Nightmares were especially concerning. If you woke up unable to move, they said a demon, the mayor, was sitting on your chest. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was just Tuesday night with the devil in your bedroom. Beds themselves told little stories of class. Poor villagers crammed together in one room, sometimes with livestock. Nobles slept on raised frames with curtains, not for style, but to stop things from falling on their heads from the rafters. Rodents dropping onto pillows was a real hazard. Kings and queens had feather mattresses and silk covers, but the castles around them were freezing. The bed might look luxurious, but the stone chamber was basically a giant refrigerator. So they piled on furs, servants huddled in corners, and fires smoked uselessly in drafty hearths. Romance. Medieval style. This broken sleep lasted for centuries. It was normal because nights were long, and candles were expensive. People went to bed shortly after sunset, especially in winter. If you crawl into bed at 6 p.m., of course you're going to wake up in the middle of the night. The body wasn't meant to do 12 hours in a row. So the rhythm evolved naturally. First sleep, watch, second sleep. So why did it vanish? Light. Candles got cheaper. Oil lamps improved. By the 17th and 18th centuries, gas lamps started brightening cities. People stayed up later. Bedtime shifted closer to midnight. Suddenly, there wasn't enough night left to split into two. And then doctors started declaring segmented sleep unhealthy. Which was kind of funny, considering people had been doing it for thousands of years without complaint. But Victorian doctors were always declaring things unhealthy. Breathing too much air, walking too quickly, women having opinions, all classified as disorders at one time or another. So the tradition faded. Today, if you wake up at 2 a.m., you don't call it the watch. You call it insomnia. You stress about it. You check your phone. You scroll until sunrise. But in the Middle Ages, being awake at that hour was perfectly natural. It was just part of the rhythm of the night. And maybe there's something oddly comforting in that. To think our bodies haven't changed, only our schedules have. To know that if you're lying awake, staring at the ceiling, you're not broken. You're just living the way your ancestors did. Sharing a quiet hour with centuries of peasants, nobles, monks, and yes, pigs. So if you wake tonight, don't panic. Maybe take a page out of their book. Sit quietly. Breathe. Tell yourself a story. Wait for second sleep to come. It always did, back then. And it will for you, too. And with that, we close our wanderings. Now, imagine you're on a creaking wooden ship in the ancient Mediterranean. The wind is in your face, you've got a cargo full of wine, oil, maybe a goat or two, and you're desperately hoping you don't smash into the Egyptian coastline. And then, in the distance, a light. A flame. Towering above the waves, higher than anything you've ever seen, guiding you to safety. That was the lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And unlike some of the other wonders, which were basically rich guy builds giant tomb, this one had an actual purpose. It wasn't just for show. It saved lives. Which is why sailors adored it, and why historians can't stop swooning over it centuries later. Now, Alexandria itself was a bit of an overachiever. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. Because of course he couldn't just conquer things, he had to name entire cities after himself. Alexandria became Egypt's big coastal hub. After Alexander conveniently died young, and left everyone fighting over his empire like squabbling children, his general Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. And Ptolemy, not content with just ruling, wanted his capital to scream, "Look how important I am." So he built things. A great library, which was essentially one long copyright violation project where they seized every scroll from visiting ships and made copies. And, of course, the lighthouse. The Pharos. Built on a little island just offshore. Let's pause here. Because the lighthouse wasn't just tall. It was jaw-droppingly tall for the time. Ancient writers say anywhere from 300 to 400 feet. To put that into perspective, that's like a 40-story building. Out of stone. With no cranes. No steel girders. Just human backs, wooden pulleys, and maybe a few donkeys looking deeply unimpressed. The design was elegant. A square base, stacked with solid blocks. Then a middle cylinder rising above it. And finally, a smaller tower at the top. 3 tiers, tapering like some ancient stone layer cake. On top of that, the flame. A giant fire burning night after night, fed constantly with wood and oil. And because fire alone wasn't dramatic enough, the Ptolemies supposedly added polished bronze mirrors to reflect and magnify the light. By day, the mirrors flashed sunlight across the sea. By night, they threw the fire's glow far beyond the coastline. Sailors could spot it from over 30 miles away. Which, for people navigating with stars, birds, and sheer guesswork, was basically like someone giving them Google Maps. Of course, legends grew. People swore the mirrors could focus the light into a death ray, setting enemy ships on fire. Which sounds great in theory, but no. Bronze is shiny, but it's not a super weapon. Unless you count blinding someone temporarily while they're trying to eat olives on deck. But the rumor stuck, because it's always more fun to believe a lighthouse could double as a laser cannon. The lighthouse wasn't just functional, though. It was a statement. It told the world, Alexandria isn't just any port. It's the port. The safe harbor, the center of trade, the jewel of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies wanted sailors to be impressed, merchants to feel secure, and rivals to feel just a little jealous. And it worked. The Pharos became so famous that Pharos became the word for lighthouse in multiple languages. If your monument changes vocabulary forever, you've done something right. Now, life inside the lighthouse probably wasn't glamorous. Imagine being the poor guy whose job was fuel duty. Hauling logs or jars of oil up endless ramps to keep the flame alive. Up and down. Day after day. You'd get thighs of steel, sure, but your job description would essentially be, keep the world's most important bonfire burning. No pressure. Sailors, meanwhile, loved it. Imagine drifting through the dark, praying you weren't about to crash into an invisible sandbank, and suddenly seeing that beacon. Relief doesn't even cover it. The Pharos wasn't just a building. It was hope. It meant survival. For centuries, the lighthouse stood strong. Travelers described it in glowing terms, usually exaggerating the size, because ancient writers never met a measurement they couldn't stretch. Some said it touched the heavens. Others claimed the light was visible hundreds of miles away, which, unless the Ptolemies discovered nuclear fusion, is a bit unlikely. But still, the fact that everyone kept talking about it tells you it made an impression. But, as with all wonders, time had other plans. Earthquakes rocked the Egyptian coast. In 956, 1303, and again in 1323, massive quakes shook Alexandria. Each one chipped away at the Great Tower. First cracks, then collapses, until finally, the Pharos was no more. By the late Middle Ages, it had vanished from the skyline. Sailors still needed guidance, but the wonder of wonders was just a memory. And yet, not completely gone. Because the stones didn't disappear. They fell into the harbor. In the 20th century, divers found them. Massive blocks, some carved, resting quietly on the sea floor. Archaeologists even raised some, piecing together how the lighthouse once looked. Today, you can see fragments in Alexandria, reminders of a tower that lit the sea 2,000 years ago. What makes the lighthouse of Alexandria so soothing to think about is how decent it was. Unlike temples built to inflate kings' egos, or tombs stuffed with treasure no one was supposed to touch, the Pharos existed to help. To save sailors, protect merchants, make the sea just a little less terrifying. It was practical, and yet monumental. A gift, wrapped in limestone. And maybe that's why it lingered in memory as one of the great wonders. Not because it was extravagant, but because it was useful. Because it mattered to ordinary people, the sailors, traders, and wanderers who spotted its flame and sighed in relief. For them, it wasn't just a tower. It was home on the horizon. So next time you see a lighthouse, even a small one, flashing its beam across a quiet bay, remember the Pharos. The ancestor of them all. Rising high, blazing bright, and reminding weary travelers that someone, somewhere, wanted them to make it back alive. And with that, we'll drift inland, away from the waves, into the torchlit palaces of China, where another kind of figure waited in the shadows. Men who weren't kings, weren't generals, but somehow held the strings of empire. The eunuchs of the Han dynasty, whisperers behind the throne. So, we've left behind Alexandria's glittering beacon and the poor guy hauling oil up the ramps, and now we're stepping into the silent corridors of ancient China. Picture it, polished wooden beams, bronze lamps flickering, silk robes swishing softly across marble floors. And somewhere in those long palace hallways, a man in plain clothes who isn't noble, isn't military, and isn't even technically a whole man anymore, but who somehow controls the emperor's every move. Yes, the eunuchs. Those unlucky, or maybe lucky depending on your perspective, figures who were permanently altered so they could serve in the palace without ever being tempted by, shall we say, extracurricular activities with the emperor's concubines. The logic was straightforward: no equipment, no dynasty of your own, no threat. In theory, safe. In practice, absolutely not. Because when you take away family ambition, what you often get instead is ruthless dedication to palace power. And in the Han dynasty, the eunuchs perfected that. The Han dynasty itself was massive. 400 years of emperors ruling as the sons of heaven, claiming divine mandate, wearing robes so heavy you could probably use them as tents. But emperors were often young, sickly, or completely uninterested in paperwork, which left a little vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped the eunuchs, with their quiet voices and endless access. At first, they were just servants, tending chambers, preparing food, guarding the harems. Harmless stuff. But here's the trick: proximity. Ministers and generals had to beg for audiences. Eunuchs were always there, pouring tea, carrying scrolls, tucking the emperor into bed. If you control who gets in the door, you control everything. A minister's brilliant plan is useless if it never reaches the emperor's ears. And the eunuch standing at the door gets to decide. Over time, some emperors grew up surrounded by eunuchs more than by their own families. Imagine being crowned as a child, raised in isolation, with these men acting as caretakers, protectors, sometimes even father figures. Ministers were stern old Confucians quoting philosophy. Eunuchs were the ones bringing you snacks and making sure your blanket wasn't too itchy. Who would you trust more? Exactly. By the Eastern Han, eunuchs weren't just trusted. They were running the show. They controlled access to the throne. They decided which documents got signed, which generals got promoted, which relatives mysteriously stopped being a problem. They started selling government posts, because why not turn a profit while you're at it? Officials could pay their way into office, and eunuchs pocketed the bribes. Everyone pretended not to notice, because what were you going to do, argue with the emperor's best friends? The Confucian ministers hated this. They considered themselves the rightful guardians of statecraft, the moral backbone of the dynasty. And nothing was more insulting than having to grovel before low-born eunuchs who had clawed their way up from servitude. To them, the eunuchs were corrupt parasites. To the eunuchs, the ministers were pompous hypocrites. And both sides were right. The rivalry escalated. Emperors leaned on eunuchs to counterbalance aristocratic clans. Ministers launched purges to try to wipe out eunuch influence. Eunuchs retaliated with purges of their own. Sometimes, entire families of officials were executed on accusations whispered by eunuchs in the emperor's ear. Other times, eunuchs were slaughtered when factions at court finally had enough. It was a centuries-long game of bloody ping-pong, except no one was really winning. One infamous clique of eunuchs became known as the 10 Attendants. Were there actually 10? Of course not. Ancient historians loved round numbers almost as much as they loved complaining about eunuchs. The 10 Attendants were blamed for everything: corruption, mismanagement, bribery, even the weakening of the empire itself. Were they really the sole cause? Probably not. But history books, written by scholars who despised them, made sure the eunuchs got top billing as villains. And yet, it wasn't always so black and white. Some eunuchs were genuinely loyal. They protected young emperors from scheming relatives. They acted as stabilizers in chaotic times. A few even became famous for integrity and restraint, which is not usually what you expect from people remembered mostly as court manipulators. But because history was written by their enemies, those good stories were mostly buried. What survived were the scandals. It's also worth noting the irony. Eunuchs were supposed to be powerless. Their condition was meant to exclude them from dynastic politics. And precisely because of that, emperors trusted them. And because emperors trusted them, they gained the ultimate power: direct, daily access. The thing ministers wanted most. The system designed to keep them safe ended up putting them in charge. The eunuchs' dominance didn't last forever. By the end of the Han Dynasty, infighting between eunuchs and ministers had hollowed the government. Rebellions broke out. Warlords rose. The dynasty crumbled into chaos. And in that collapse, many eunuchs were massacred, their palaces stormed, their power extinguished. But the pattern didn't die. Later dynasties repeated it. Tang, Ming, over and over again, eunuchs rose, ruled, and fell. In the Ming, one eunuch, Zheng He, even commanded treasure fleets across the oceans. Not bad for a group that was supposedly safe. If you visit the ruins of Han palaces today, they're quiet. Crumbling walls, faded stones, weeds sprouting where once there were bustling courtyards. But it's not hard to imagine the shadows of eunuchs gliding silently through the halls, carrying scrolls, delivering food, leaning down to murmur in the emperor's ear. They weren't kings. They weren't nobles. But they shaped empires, one whisper at a time. And maybe that's the thought to carry with you tonight. That history isn't just about the obvious figures. Sometimes, it's about the ones in the background. The people who were supposed to be powerless, but who ended up controlling everything. Not through armies, not through dynasties, but through access, and proximity, and the trust of someone who sat on the throne. And with that, let's let the palace lamps burn down, and drift onward. Because next, we're going to step back into the rhythm of the medieval night. Into cottages where families slept beside their animals, into monasteries where bells rang at 2 a.m., into a world where sleep itself was divided into two halves. The strange, forgotten practice of first sleep and second sleep. So, we've left the silent corridors of Han palaces and the soft footsteps of eunuchs, and now we're stumbling into something a little closer to home. The medieval night. Dark, damp, smoky, and full of people who definitely didn't sleep the way you and I do. Because, surprise, back then, night wasn't one long snooze. It came in two parts. People called it first sleep and second sleep, which, I admit, sounds like something out of a Hobbit's daily planner. But it was real. Everyone from peasants in huts to nobles in castles talked about it as if it was completely normal. Which, to them, it was. Picture yourself in 14th century Europe. You've just finished a long day of not dying, which is already an achievement. Maybe you plowed a field, spun wool, or argued with your landlord about taxes you couldn't pay. Dinner was bread, beans, and whatever you could scrounge. If you were lucky, maybe a scrap of bacon. And then, night. Candles were expensive. Firewood was precious. Once the sun set, there wasn't much point in staying up. So you and your family crawled into bed. And bed here doesn't mean anything Instagram-worthy. It meant a straw mattress, possibly crawling with lice, and if you were poor, you shared it with your entire family. Children, spouse, maybe even the cow in the corner if the winter was harsh enough. Everyone packed in together like it was one big slumber party, minus the marshmallows and ghost stories. You'd fall asleep quickly, because exhaustion is better than melatonin. That was your first sleep. 4, maybe 5 hours later, you'd wake up. And here's the weird part. You didn't panic. You didn't toss and turn. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't insomnia. It was just, what happened? People called this interval the watch. Some prayed. Monks especially. Monks loved a midnight prayer service. They were basically the original night owls, shuffling into chapels at ungodly hours to chant psalms while everyone else muttered into their blankets. Ordinary villagers used the watch for quieter things. Tending the fire. Talking softly. Maybe telling a story or two. Doctors even recommended this time as the best for intimacy. Apparently, being half asleep made you healthier, holier, and possibly less likely to annoy your neighbors with noise. It wasn't always solemn, though. In villages, people sometimes visited each other during the watch. Imagine that today, it's 1:30 in the morning, your neighbor knocks with a candle stub and says, "Hey, couldn't sleep. Want to chat about your pig?" And instead of calling the cops, you shrug and make room by the fire. That was normal. Night wasn't silent. It was just slower. And then there were dreams. Dreams mattered a lot. Waking after first sleep meant you remembered them vividly, and people thought they had meaning. A dream of falling, a warning. A dream of feasting, a sign of abundance. A dream of fish, probably something ominous, because in medieval Europe, everything was ominous. Nightmares were especially serious. If you woke up unable to move, that was proof a demon, a mare, had sat on your chest. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was Tuesday night with Satan in your room. Beds, meanwhile, revealed social class. Peasants piled into one room, snoring, scratching, and occasionally kicking each other in the face. Nobles had wooden bed frames with curtains. Not for privacy, but for warmth, and to stop things from falling on them from the rafters. Mice. Dust. The occasional falling lizard. A canopy bed wasn't luxury. It was insurance. And then there were castles. Massive, drafty, stone refrigerators. A royal bed might look gorgeous, with silks and embroidery, but the room was freezing. Smoke from the fireplace barely made a dent in the cold. Servants often slept nearby, partly to help, partly to share body heat. So yes, the king was technically wrapped in velvet and fur, but he was still shivering while rats scuttled across the floor. So, how did this rhythm vanish? Blame light. As candles got cheaper and oil lamps better, people stayed up later. By the 17th and 18th centuries, bedtime crept closer to midnight. Suddenly, there wasn't enough night left to split in two. By the 19th century, doctors decided segmented sleep was a disorder. Which is hilarious, because humanity had been doing it for thousands of years without issue. But the Victorians loved diagnosing things. If you so much as sneezed at the wrong time, they'd call it a syndrome. Today, if you wake at 2 a.m., you freak out. You scroll on your phone. You Google, "Do I have insomnia?" while lying in the blue glow of your screen. But in the Middle Ages, you just poke the fire, mutter a prayer, or tell your kids a story. No stress. No guilt. Just part of the night. And maybe that's the oddly comforting bit. If you find yourself awake in the dark hours, You're not broken. You're just medieval. You're living the rhythm your ancestors knew by heart. First sleep, watch, second sleep. A pause in the middle of the night that wasn't failure, but tradition. So the next time you wake at 3 a.m., don't panic. Maybe pretend you're a monk waiting for matins, or a farmer stoking the hearth. Maybe just breathe, and wait. Second sleep will come. It always did. And with that, we'll gently close the shutters on our medieval cottage. Because there's still one more story waiting. One more set of lives to wander through. And this time, we're heading back to Mesopotamia, to a king who collected more books than anyone else in the ancient world, even if his books were basically bricks. Ashurbanipal, and his great library at Nineveh. So, we've wandered through medieval cottages, past snoring peasants and demons sitting on chests, and now we're drifting even further back. Back to the 7th century BCE. To Mesopotamia, land of clay, kings, and more dramatic inscriptions than you can shake a chisel at. And there, in the city of Nineveh, one particular king decided he didn't just want to conquer people. He wanted to conquer knowledge. Meet Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, ruler of one of the most famously brutal empires in history. This was a state where diplomacy often meant surrender or we'll flay you alive. And yet, Ashurbanipal had a hobby that seems almost out of character. He loved books. Or at least, the Mesopotamian version of books, which were heavy clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing. Now, most kings of his day couldn't read. Reading was for scribes. You dictated what you wanted, they scribbled it down, and that was that. But Ashurbanipal was different. He could actually read and write in multiple languages, which made him, by ancient standards, a massive nerd. And like all nerds, he wanted a collection. So he built one. The Library of Nineveh. Thousands upon thousands of tablets, stacked in palace rooms, covering every subject you could imagine. Religion, medicine, astrology, poetry, tax records, omens. If it was written on clay, Ashurbanipal wanted it. And because he was king, collecting wasn't about gently borrowing from other libraries. It was about sending soldiers to loot temples and scribal houses. Yes, yes, take the gold and the captives, but don't forget those dusty tablets in the corner. The result? A library so vast that some estimates put it at over 30,000 tablets. That's a lot of mud. Of course, half of them were duplicates, because Ashurbanipal was nothing if not paranoid about losing information. But still, it was the closest thing the ancient world had to a central archive. And the content was priceless. One of the most famous works preserved there was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Without Ashurbanipal's hoarding habits, that story might have been lost forever. Instead, we can still read about Gilgamesh sulking his way through adventures, befriending a wild man, and dealing with an epic flood that suspiciously echoes later stories. Other tablets were less glamorous. Endless lists of omens. If a sheep's liver looks like this, doom. If a bird flies that way, also doom. Ancient people really leaned into the whole everything is a sign from the gods lifestyle. There were also medical texts, full of remedies that ranged from clever to horrifying. Apply beer to wound actually makes sense, alcohol disinfects. Burn turtle shell and rub the ashes on patient sounds less promising. And let's not even start on the dental advice. What's fascinating is that Ashurbanipal didn't just collect for fun. He saw knowledge as power. He wanted to understand the will of the gods, the secrets of medicine, the histories of lands he conquered. He wanted every scrap of wisdom written down and locked away in his palace. Because while gold can be stolen and empires can fall, writing, if preserved, endures. Not that Ashurbanipal was some peaceful scholar. He was still an Assyrian king, which meant plenty of bloodshed on the side. The same man who treasured poetry also bragged in inscriptions about torturing prisoners and parading defeated kings in chains. It's a strange combination. Imagine your local librarian, but also running a side hustle as a warlord. That was Ashurbanipal. But here's the twist. His empire didn't last. After his death, Assyria collapsed spectacularly. Nineveh was besieged and burned in 612 BCE. And yet, the fire that destroyed the palace preserved the library. Because when clay tablets are caught in a massive blaze, they don't crumble, they bake harder, like pottery. So while walls fell and people fled, the tablet survived, stacked in ruins, waiting. Fast forward 2,000 years. 19th century archaeologists dug into the rubble of Nineveh and found them. Piles of tablets with strange wedge marks. At first, they had no idea what they'd uncovered. Just bricks with doodles. But slowly, scholars cracked the code of cuneiform, piecing together voices that hadn't been heard for millennia. It must have been eerie. Reading a letter written by a priest 2,500 years earlier, or a king's decree scratched into clay before Rome even existed. Suddenly, the ancient world wasn't just ruins. It was speaking again. And all because one king couldn't resist hoarding books. Of course, early translators sometimes got carried away. Victorians especially loved to dramatize things. They waved around flood myths from Gilgamesh as proof of the Bible's stories, while ignoring the less exciting parts of the library, like shipping manifests and debt lists. Because nothing kills the mood like realizing half the world's first great library was basically paperwork. But still, Ashurbanipal's obsession gave us something priceless. A window into the ancient Mesopotamian mind. Their fears, their hopes, their strange remedies, their cosmic signs. Without him, so much of that would have vanished. And maybe that's why his story feels so oddly soothing. Because here was a man who ruled brutally, but who also believed that knowledge mattered. That writing mattered. That clay tablets, scratched with wedges, were worth saving. He probably imagined his library as a monument to his reign. Instead, it became a monument to something bigger. The endurance of memory. So next time you stare at your bookshelf, groaning under the weight of novels you'll never read, or scroll endlessly through your saved PDFs, remember Ashurbanipal. He was the original book hoarder. And unlike us, his collection really did outlast him. By thousands of years. Now, we're heading into the palaces of the Han Dynasty. China, more than 2,000 years ago. A dynasty that gave its name to an entire people. A dynasty that lasted 4 centuries. And a dynasty where the fate of emperors often rested not in the hands of noble ministers or warrior families, but in the quiet grip of palace eunuchs. Eunuchs, in case you need the refresher, were men who'd undergone a certain irreversible surgery. The idea was simple. Remove the possibility of fathering children, and you remove the temptation of setting up your own dynasty. The emperor could keep them close, confident that they wouldn't turn around and try to found Eunuch Family Incorporated. On paper, they were safe, loyal, dependable. In reality, they became some of the most powerful and feared figures in Chinese history. Because when you take away family ambition, you don't erase ambition entirely. You just concentrate it in one direction. And that direction was always the emperor himself. At first, eunuchs had simple jobs. Serving in the inner palace, carrying food, guarding the imperial women, fussing over details like curtains and candles. Menial work. Nothing to worry about. But here's the trick. Proximity. Ministers and generals only saw the emperor in formal settings, with layers of ceremony. Eunuchs were there all the time. Bringing food. Delivering documents. Tucking the emperor into bed. If you control the doors to power, you control power itself. Now imagine being a child emperor. It happened more often than you'd think. A kid of 8 or 9 suddenly declared son of heaven, shoved onto the throne with a crown too big for his head. Relatives scheming. Ministers barking orders. Generals salivating at the chance to protect the throne, usually code for run things ourselves. Who does that child turn to? Not the scary old officials quoting Confucius. Not the relatives plotting behind curtains. He turns to the men who've been raising him. The eunuchs. And so the bond formed. Young emperors grew up trusting eunuchs as caretakers, confidants, sometimes even as substitute fathers. That bond lasted into adulthood. And with it came power. Power the ministers despised, but couldn't dislodge. By the Eastern Han period, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were kingmakers. They blocked rival factions, whispered in the emperor's ear, and, when necessary, arranged for inconvenient enemies to suffer very sudden illnesses. They controlled the gate to the throne. No audience unless they allowed it. No decree unless they delivered it. Ministers could shout, generals could march, but if the eunuch said no, nothing happened. Naturally, the Confucian scholar officials hated this with the burning passion of 1,000 candles. They were supposed to be the moral guardians of the dynasty, armed with classics and ritual. And now they had to beg favors from low-born eunuchs who, in their view, were little more than mutilated servants. Imagine a Harvard graduate forced to grovel before a janitor, except the janitor can decide if your family lives or dies. That was the vibe. And the eunuchs did not exactly help their image. They took bribes. They sold government offices like they were running a Black Friday sale. They promoted their friends and demoted their enemies. A clique known as the 10 Attendants became infamous in the late Han, supposedly a cabal of 10 eunuchs who ran the court like their personal fiefdom. Were there really only 10? Of course not. Ancient historians loved round numbers the way modern tabloids love exaggerations. But the label stuck, and so did the reputation for corruption. Purges followed. Ministers tried to slaughter eunuchs. Eunuchs persuaded emperors to slaughter ministers. Entire families were wiped out on whispered accusations. The palace must have felt like one long episode of Political Survivor, except no one was ever voted off the island gently. And yet, not every eunuch was corrupt. History remembers the villains because most of the records we have come from Confucian scholars, the eunuchs' sworn enemies. But some were genuinely loyal. They protected child emperors from grasping relatives. They worked tirelessly to keep the palace stable during crises. They acted as buffers between emperors and officials who wanted too much. Their names are harder to find, because quiet loyalty doesn't make for juicy history. But it existed. The irony is hard to miss. The entire system was designed to keep eunuchs powerless. Their condition was supposed to exclude them from dynastic politics. And precisely because of that, emperors trusted them. And precisely because emperors trusted them, they became the most powerful voices in the palace. A perfect example of how trying to outsmart human ambition usually just reroutes it. Of course, it all ended badly. By the late 2nd century CE, infighting between eunuchs and ministers had hollowed the empire. While they fought, peasants starved, corruption spread, and rebellions like the Yellow Turbans shook the land. Warlords rose, the Han dynasty fractured, and eunuchs were massacred in the chaos. Palaces stormed, whispers silenced, the cycle reset. And yet, later dynasties brought them back. The Tang had their eunuchs. The Ming had theirs. One eunuch, Jing He, even commanded treasure fleets across oceans. The pattern repeated: rise, influence, resentment, purge. Over and over again. So tonight, as you drift, picture the Han Palace. Lanterns glowing softly. Curtains of silk swaying in the draft. Ministers muttering in frustration outside the gates. And inside, a eunuch walking quietly down a polished corridor, carrying a scroll. Pausing at the emperor's chamber. Whispering advice. Not a king. Not a general. But somehow, holding the empire in his hands. And with that, let's leave the palace behind and step into something a little more ordinary. Ordinary, but still very strange. Because in medieval Europe, the nights weren't smooth stretches of sleep like ours. They were broken in two, with a quiet interval in the middle. First sleep. Second sleep. The forgotten rhythm of the night. So, we've tiptoed out of the Han Palace, away from eunuchs whispering at chamber doors, and now we're stumbling into something far more relatable: sleep. Though, to be fair, medieval Europe managed to make even that weird. Because unlike us, with our tidy 8-hour blocks, they treated night as two separate shifts. First sleep. Then a pause. Then second sleep. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't even considered unusual. It was just life. Everyone knew what first sleep meant, from peasants dozing in smoky huts to monks wrapped in itchy wool habits to nobles shivering in drafty castles. Picture it. You're a farmer in 14th century England. You've spent the day knee-deep in mud, dragging a plough behind a cow that clearly hates you, eating bread so dark it could double as a roof tile. Dinner is whatever stew you've managed to scrape together. Then the sun sets, the fire dies down, and candles are too expensive to waste. So, everyone just goes to bed. And bed doesn't mean four-poster elegance. It means a sack stuffed with straw, crawling with lice, and probably shared with your entire family. And maybe a chicken. Or the pig. Because yes, keeping livestock inside meant warmth. Nothing like the smell of manure to lull you into dreamland. You fall asleep quickly, because exhaustion trumps comfort. That's your first sleep. 4 hours later, you wake up. Not panicked. Not stressed. Just awake. And so is everybody else. This was the watch. That middle-of-the-night interlude where people prayed, poked at the fire, or whispered stories. Monks shuffled off to chant psalms, because nothing says holiness like dragging yourself into a freezing chapel at 2 a.m. Doctors even recommended this time as ideal for intimacy, because, apparently, being half asleep made it healthier and more virtuous. Medieval medicine is basically one long because I said so. Sometimes people just visited neighbors. Imagine it's 1:30 in the morning, you knock on the door with a candle stub in hand, and instead of calling the guards, your neighbor says, "Oh good, you're up too. Come in, let's complain about the miller again." That was normal. Night wasn't silent. It was just slower. Dreams, too, played their part. People remembered their dreams most vividly after first sleep, and they took them seriously. Whole manuals existed to decode them. Dream of falling? Bad omen. Dream of eating? Prosperity's coming. Dream of fish? Honestly, probably doom, because medieval people assumed everything was doom. And if you woke up paralyzed, unable to move, that was proof a demon, the mayor, had sat on your chest. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was just Wednesday night with Satan. Beds, meanwhile, reflected class as much as comfort. Peasants had their straw sacks. Nobles had wooden frames with curtains. Not for luxury, but to block drafts and, more importantly, to stop things from falling out of the rafters. Dust, bugs, the occasional rat. Canopy beds weren't invented for romance. They were pest control. Castles were worse. Giant stone refrigerators. Even with fires roaring, the air stayed freezing. So nobles piled on furs, servants huddled close for warmth, and still the royal nose turned blue. A king might sleep on embroidered cushions, but he was shivering just like the pig farmer. So, how did this rhythm vanish? Simple, light. As candles got cheaper and oil lamps improved, people stayed awake later. By the 17th and 18th centuries, bedtime shifted closer to midnight. There wasn't enough time for 2 sleeps anymore. By the 19th century, doctors were diagnosing segmented sleep as a disorder. Because, of course, Victorians couldn't resist labeling everything unhealthy: fainting spells, tight corsets, women reading novels. Why not add waking up at night to the list? Today, if you wake at 2 a.m., you stress. You reach for your phone, scroll through doom, and decide you're broken. But in the Middle Ages, you'd shrug, poke the embers, maybe whisper a prayer, and wait for second sleep to roll in. It wasn't failure. It was normal. And maybe that's the oddly comforting lesson here. If you find yourself awake in the dark hours, you're not malfunctioning. You're just medieval. You're living like your ancestors did for centuries. Sharing a quiet hour with farmers, monks, nobles, and yes, the pig in the corner. So the next time your eyes pop open in the middle of the night, don't panic. Breathe. Pretend you're waiting for matins in a monastery, or gossiping with a neighbor about grain prices. Second sleep will come. It always did. And with that, let's slip out of the smoky cottage, close the creaky shutters, and drift back further in time. To a shining city on the sea, where a colossal tower rose above the harbor. Flames blazing, mirrors flashing, guiding sailors home across dark waters. The lighthouse of Alexandria. So, we've wandered out of smoky medieval bedrooms, past peasants scratching in straw and monks muttering in chapels, and now we're stepping onto the deck of an ancient ship. The waves are rolling, the stars are hiding behind clouds, and the coastline of Egypt is somewhere out there, filled with sandbanks, rocks, and every possible opportunity to sink your cargo of olives. And then, there it is. A light. Flickering above the horizon. A flame so high it almost looks like it's hanging in the sky. The lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and one of the very few wonders that was actually useful. The others? Mostly monuments to dead men with too much money. A giant tomb here, a massive temple there, a giant statue glaring down at you for reasons no one really remembers. But the lighthouse? It wasn't about ego. Okay, it was partly about ego, it's always about ego, but it was also about survival. Sailors adored it. Merchants depended on it. It was a wonder that actually earned its keep. It all started with Alexander the Great. Of course it did. The man couldn't pass a coastline without founding a city and naming it after himself. Alexandria became his most famous namesake, a bustling hub of trade where Greek ambition met Egyptian grain supplies. After Alexander inconveniently dropped dead at 32, proving that conquering half the known world is not great for your health, his general Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. And Ptolemy wanted his capital to be a showpiece. So, he ordered monuments. The library, where they stole every scroll they could get their hands on. And the lighthouse, built on a little island called Pharos. From then on, the very word Pharos became shorthand for lighthouse in half the world's languages. Imagine building something so famous it renames the entire category. Now, the numbers vary, because ancient writers loved exaggerating. Some said the lighthouse stood 300 feet tall. Others swore it was 400. Either way, it was enormous. A stone tower rising in 3 tiers, a square base, a cylindrical middle, and a smaller tower at the top. Like a wedding cake for giants. And perched on top of it all, the flame. This wasn't a cozy candle. It was a bonfire, roaring every night. Workers hauled wood and oil up spiral ramps wide enough for donkeys. Because, of course, if you're going to keep the world's biggest nightlight going, you don't do it alone. You get donkey labor. The eternal flame of the ancient world was probably powered by a very unimpressed donkey named Gerasimos. By day, polished bronze mirrors reflected sunlight across the sea. By night, they magnified the fire. Sailors could see it from more than 30 miles away, which, when you're navigating with stars, waves, and desperate prayer, was basically like someone installing a neon sign saying, "This way to safety." Naturally, myths followed. Some said the mirrors could focus the light into a burning beam, setting enemy ships ablaze. Which sounds spectacular and very cinematic, and also completely impossible. Bronze mirrors are shiny, but they're not laser cannons. At best, you'd annoy a captain by flashing light in his eyes. But still, people loved the story, because who doesn't want a wonder of the world to double as a death ray? For centuries, the lighthouse did its job. Travelers described it in glowing terms, usually exaggerating how bright or how tall it was. Ancient writers were basically the Yelp reviewers of their time. 5 stars, visible from 100 miles away, would sail again. It became a symbol of Alexandria itself, along with the library. The city wasn't just a port. It was the port. But of course, nothing that big lasts forever. Earthquakes rocked the Egyptian coast again and again.
In 956, in 1303, in 1323.
Each one chipped away at the lighthouse until, finally, it crumbled. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, it was gone. Not even a ruin, just recycled stone, repurposed into fortresses. The Pharos had gone from wonder to rubble to construction material. A depressing end, but also a very practical one. Still, not everything vanished. In the 20th century, divers found the fallen stones lying on the seabed of Alexandria's harbor. Huge blocks, carvings, fragments of the once great tower. Some were even raised and put in museums. The lighthouse may be gone from the skyline, but it lingers under the waves, waiting. And maybe that's why it feels different from the other wonders. It wasn't a temple to a god or a tomb for a king. It was a gift to sailors. A massive, burning promise, "We'll guide you home." Sure, it was also a flex by the Ptolemies, because rulers can't resist flexing. But at its heart, it was a monument to something practical. A wonder with a purpose. Picture it one last time, the sea rough and dark, sailors exhausted, and then a glow in the distance. Relief spreading across the deck. A city waiting, safe harbor ahead. That's what the lighthouse stood for. Hope, safety, a light in the dark. And with that, we'll leave the waves behind and drift inland again. Back to a different kind of hoard, one not of light but of clay. A king who collected more books than anyone else in the ancient world. A library filled with omens, medical recipes, and epic poetry, all scratched into mud. Ashurbanipal's Library of Nineveh. So, we've drifted past whispering eunuchs in China, broken medieval dreams in smoky cottages, and a colossal lighthouse blazing over the sea. For our last wander tonight, let's go back even further. To Mesopotamia. To the Assyrian Empire. And to a king who wanted to be remembered not just for cruelty, though he was plenty cruel, but for his love of books. Ashurbanipal. He ruled in the 7th century BCE, at the height of Assyria's power. And while most kings like to brag about the size of their palaces, their armies, or how many neighbors they'd crushed that week, Ashurbanipal bragged about something different, his ability to read. That sounds underwhelming to us, but for a king back then, it was rare. Reading and writing were jobs for scribes. Kings gave orders, scribes made wedge marks on clay, and that was that. But Ashurbanipal? He wanted to do the scribbling himself. Naturally, once you can read, you start collecting. And once you're an Assyrian king, collecting doesn't mean browsing a shop. It means ordering soldiers to loot temples and scribal houses, carrying off anything remotely tablet-shaped. He wanted everything: omens, myths, medical recipes, hymns, tax records, letters. If it could be written down, he wanted it in Nineveh. And so, his palace filled with tablets. Tens of thousands of them. Some say over 30,000. That's a lot of baked mud. And yes, many were duplicates. He liked having backups. But together, they formed the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Among its treasures was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Without Ashurbanipal's hoarding, we might never have heard of Gilgamesh sulking around Mesopotamia, befriending a wild man, and worrying about death after a giant flood. Other tablets described omens in exhausting detail: sheep entrails, bird flights, dreams, all turned into cosmic signs. Honestly, if you believed them all, doom was always around the corner. Then there were the medical texts, which swung between surprisingly practical, wash the wound with beer, and slightly alarming, burn turtle shell and smear the ashes on patient. You had to take the good with the bizarre, and Ashurbanipal collected it all. Because he understood, in a way few kings did, that knowledge was power. Knowing the will of the gods, the cures for disease, the histories of conquered lands, all of it mattered. Armies could win battles, but knowledge shaped how people thought about the world. And he wanted that under lock and key. Not that he was gentle about it. He was still an Assyrian king, which meant cruelty was basically part of the uniform. He paraded defeated kings in chains. He had prisoners mutilated. His inscriptions brag about the bodies piled outside city gates. So yes, he was a bibliophile, but one with very bloody hands. Imagine a librarian who insists you return books on time, or else. Of course, empires fall. After Ashurbanipal, Assyria unraveled. By 612 BCE, Nineveh was besieged and burned. The palace went up in flames. But here's the twist: those flames preserved the tablets. When clay is caught in fire, it hardens. Instead of crumbling, the tablets baked, like pottery. The palace collapsed, but the library survived, buried in ruins. 2,000 years later, 19th century archaeologists dug into Nineveh and stumbled across piles of tablets. At first, they didn't realize what they'd found. Just stacks of bricks with odd wedge marks. Slowly, though, scholars cracked cuneiform, and the voices of Mesopotamia came back to life. Priests muttering prayers. Kings issuing decrees. Farmers recording debts. Doctors prescribing beer for wounds. It was all there. Victorian scholars, being Victorians, loved the dramatic bits. They waved around Gilgamesh's flood story as proof of the Bible, while ignoring the less glamorous parts, like endless shipping manifests. Because nothing ruins a good discovery like realizing half the library is tax paperwork. Still, the rediscovery was extraordinary. Ashurbanipal's obsession with collecting, his need to gather every scrap of knowledge, gave us a window into a vanished world. Without him, the voices of Mesopotamia might have faded completely. Instead, we can still read their stories, their fears, their attempts to understand the stars, the gods, and their own aching teeth. And maybe that's the comforting thought to end on. That even in an empire built on conquest, one man decided words mattered too. That tablets could outlast kings. That scribbles in clay could carry across millennia, baked into permanence by fire. So next time you look at your cluttered bookshelf, or your endless stack of to-be-read PDFs, remember Ashurbanipal. You're just following in the footsteps of the world's first obsessive book hoarder. The difference is, his collection survived 3,000 years. Yours probably won't make it past your next house move. And with that, we'll close the dusty shelves of Nineveh. For stories behind us now, whispers in the palace, broken dreams in the night, a beacon blazing over the sea, and clay tablets stacked in silence. Each one a reminder that history is strange, fragile, and a little bit funny when you look at it sideways. So let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, and drift into your own second sleep. History will still be here when you wake.